Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval Austrian warfare from the 8th to the 13th century circa, focusing mostly on the Babenberg period. There's not really too much about Austria that stands out compared to other regions of the Eastern Frankish kingdom and even not in other neighboring ones that we haven't already outlined, for example, in our videos about medieval German warfare. But it's interesting, of course, in parallel with the videos we made already on the Duchy of Austria, for example, and more about the region as a whole, to highlight those features that are somehow distinctive and then can help understand not just how the army worked in locally, but also how the political social system was organized and through the same military administration, and so what was really going on in these areas. So you know that we haven't made a video exactly on that because, as you know, the Duchy of Austria is born out of the Privilegium Minus of 1156 that elevates the Ostmark, right, within the Duchy of Bavaria. So these were Bavarians technically, that to a duchy on its own, there is all a pretty intense history in the Ostsiedlung that has to do with southeastern Germany. In fact, this sort of back and forth that had occurred, especially with these were areas that had been hegemonized early on by the Franks. As you know, the same Bavaria were technically not like yet another Germanic confederacy of sort, was mostly just like a population that coalesced in a political sense under the guidance of the edges of the Merovingians, and that sort of, however, contributed towards the southeast to the expansion, in fact, of the broader Frankish world and towards the Pannonian area that, however, in the 9th and the 10th century is occupied, as you know, by the Magyars that push back and that basically come to overwhelm part of the military district that had been established by the Carolingians ever since they had conquered these areas from the Avars, for example. A very complicated history if you want to make it down the local line, and this is not the right video for it, but it's obvious that the Ostmark that eventually develops out of this is instituted by the same Charlemagne, right, and it remains, right, formally until, in fact, 1156, and stepping up to duchy, and that has, in fact, an eminently military nature. Right. And there is all a chapter of this history, especially during the 10th century against the Magyars, that is a bit underrated. Right, the Bavarians are a bit sort of the unsung heroes of the clash against the Hungars. As you know, the Ottonian, say, lesser branch came to rule in the same Bavaria. But it wouldn't enjoy such a positive, resounding press, parchment, script, as opposed to the House of Saxony proper. But these territories had probably been the ones in the face of the Magyar onslaught that had gradually weakened now, had been fighting relentlessly on the frontier. And so even before Lackville, of course, there is a lot of hard Eastern Frankish work taking place exactly from these areas. The unfortunate part is that we know really a few about that history. I will try to make at some point something more in depth on it for what we know. Today we look essentially at the development of the Ostmark and the Duchy of Austria, Österreich, in this mostly during the Babenberg period, to understand first of all how, say, down the territorial level, like the ducal or the marginal administration worked, how was the army organized, and essentially also what was the the establishment about in strictly military terms, their lifestyle, right, their nobiliar violence, etc. Right. So if we look briefly at the beginnings of this, like the duties and function of the Ostmarkgraf, right, as an office, right, they had evolved under the same Carolingians, primarily focused on military affairs. And as we've seen often in Carolingian times, so in the 10th century, a bit beyond, this districts were not necessarily connected with the official work that was to be carried out on them. The Marchio was, in accordance with the origin of his institution, connected with the missaticum, so some essentially authority sent by the emperor to take matters in his own hands locally, also with ecclesiastical support usually. The office of Marchio was essentially a royal one with specialized responsibilities that did not require a specific geographic assignment. Right? He had mostly a duty, preponderantly military in nature, ultimately leading with, say, to extra powers of command in a frontier region for the sake of protection of defense, right? And that's why the Mark, the Mark and the Marquisate, as it would later evolve in the feudal hierarchy, had technically been born. And it's at this point in history that the frontier function is sort of more pronounced. Also because, as we were pointing out before, the eastern frontier of the Eastern Frankish Kingdom is pretty unstable, is pretty undefined. There isn't any major, even geographical barrier. Like Germany does factually not have an eastern front. It never had it. Like this had accentuated also the militarization of these provinces that were, however, also generally speaking, weaker. They required for this reason an iron-fisted ruler that, say, provided with higher control, also properly on what were given to him on behalf of the king, is the ultimate military authority. That's why the thing was so important, exactly to use all the means available to counter the enemy attacks. It's not just about the Magyars, it's also about the Slavs that often act in concert. And you know that during the second invasions, indeed, provinces like Saxony, Thuringia, Bavaria, where we are, risk to be significantly destabilized, if not properly to collapse, right, under the onslaught of the Magyaro Slavs. And the Markian would thus witness this military functions like increase, like in the role and of such hot frontier. The margraves responsible for governing these border areas, namely the marches, also exercised, of course, command authority beyond their own counties, right? Because the Markian, in theory, was provided under the Carolingians just with one specific county that, it could happen for them to have more of them, and that would be the tendency historically, like in this case, so to take over like a properly provincial dimension, but they were considered enough, just like some local counts, endowed with greater military power also on the surrounding counts, which also followed just from the type of power that they were conferred. And this is evident by their supreme command of the border troops, the leadership of military campaigns against neighboring tribes, which was, again, in this era quite frequent, especially the punitive ones against the Slavs, then the defensive ones, mostly against the Magyars, and oversight of border fortifications, because obviously enough, most of the local strategy revolved around such infrastructure that, as we will see now, would be a bit like the basis around which also other vassalic beneficial relations would develop in a mostly military function. As a result, the margraves possessed, if not in formal rank, then at least in terms of their influence in power in Carolingian times, an advantage over the counts of the mark, and were thus superior to them, right? They were better people, were stronger ones, right? They were endowed with a greater imperium. Otto I, we are, as you know, in the mid-10th century, established and maintained, of course, the marches in that capacity of imperial attainment, crushing the Magyars at the Battle of Lechfeld. After again, this other Ottonian branches and his father Adriade had taken care of them, softening them up prior. He appointed margraves in Saxony, Lorraine, and after 955 also in the southeastern region. That was very open, was very undefined. Right? If you look at Austria in this historical sense, it was essentially a chunk of Bavaria, also ethno-linguistically, and however also very blended. Like as we were saying before, there was not much of a real boundary, if not the one that essentially the Eastern Franks would form just by themselves through the Ostsiedlung, the further colonization, castle building, etc. We'll see this better in some other videos specifically for this region. And by the way, I also made a video about Styria, Tyrol. Like if you are interested in the broader region, of course, also Bohemia, Hungary. I've made plenty of stuff, Bavaria, etc. So that they have all a complicated history, but once you frame it, it doesn't scare you anymore, and it's actually very, very, very interesting. So in a way, Otto was restructuring what had been the Carolingian system, the Carolingian model, right, adhering to the fundamentals, especially in the military sense. Unlike their predecessors, however, the Ottonian marches were smaller in scope and often comprised a single county, right? And part of the reason is that, of course, the process of fragmentation down to the seigneurial level, as we will see now, had occurred politically with the entrenchment of the local lords into their castles, essentially the gradual erosion of what had been the stem duchies that were, pretty sizable communities and territories of essentially provincial scale that now were gradually eroding into something more feudal and less easily representable on a map, even though the divides between, at least in the inner Germany, were still pretty strong. Like there were, as you know, huge forests that literally had come to separate the various provincial populations. Interestingly enough, still at the time which the Babenberg took over, that is, as early as around the 40s of the 10th century, the margravial office was still connected to one county, or at least we don't have mention of additional counties in contemporary sources. By the way, we do not know exactly who Leopold the Illustrious, the first Babenberg, really was, whether like the son of Berthold of Nordgau or Arnulf, the second Duke of Bavaria. This is not so relevant, but if you look at the scale of political power and territorial extension, realize that, of course, as we were describing before, this gradual rooting right into a specific area, and that the re-expansion in higher, say, later medieval times from this one would stem still from the higher nobility of people who had been ruling over these areas as a whole, and so could confer this marquional margravial power to this or that, in this case, son, for example. So initially, the Ostmark, so the etymology, of course, Ost meaning east, Österreich meaning the more eastern of kingdom, realm, referred, of course, to the geographical position of Austria. So that's a very beautiful way of putting this, because also the Germans had reminiscence from the migration era about the east, a bit like the Goths, right? I made a video about the Ostrogoths, right? The blessed by the rising sun towards this, providential destiny, further eastern expansion. The thing had always sort of remained. Was confined to a narrow strip on both sides of the Danube River. It was that small. It's something stretching essentially from the Enns to Erla to the Kleine Tulln. And by the beginning of the second millennium, however, the border had already expanded to include the Viennese forest and the Triestine area. This is interesting because even, let's say, this area was relatively... Now we come to know Austria and all her imperial grandeur in the later centuries, etc. But basically, we don't have satisfactory information about even an important city like Vienna, that, as you know, was a thing from Celto-Roman times, and also from the military point of view, in spite of its strategic relevance, was not, for this reason, overwhelmingly developed. So, exactly the military nature was connected with originally a less developed, more primitive character that eventually just over the centuries would actually grow consistently. The margrave of the Ostmark was responsible for ensuring border security, as we've seen, protecting the eastern trade route, the vital Danubian route, which depended on the existence and ownership of this central, more important fortifications. Central Europe was expanding, as you understand. The Danube was important connection with the same Constantinople. You know that from Salzburg, that is called like that because, in fact, salt was exported, was a florid trade up to the Bosphorus. And in this time in history, of course, all the issues like the stabilization of the Magyars were to be settled, in fact, by these rulers. But there was a lot of potential for which it was worth fighting. And these fortifications, we are in the age of Encastellation par excellence, primarily included fortified sites, so in the Danubian Valley and on the west bank of the Traisen, as well as later additions in the Kamp Valley and the southern Vienna woods. East of the Traisen, before crossing to the Viennese forest, important fortifications remained at Zeiselmauer, which belonged to Passau, however, upstream. That was an important bishopric, as you know. We've seen it often, like it would become very important, like in Habsburgic times as well for this. And those seized from the Magyars on the Viennese forest ridge, right? So that was probably an area of frontiers that would remain for centuries. Look at the siege of Vienna, 1683 still, so on. So these early strongholds, distinct from the later sort of more feudal, fully feudal era noble castles, were pre-urban settlements. As we were just saying, this area of Pannonia had not been particularly developed, not even in ancient times. It had always maintained a sort of military, it's a strategic function. Hence also settlements were sparser, like the migration era had, generally speaking, brought some further decay of previous settlements. Of course, many had survived and continued at this point to even develop in spite of the wars, etc. But overall, like it wasn't like a particularly stable and florid situation that they could hope for. Thus, this new fortresses, in part new, served as the primary focal point for the defense organization. that we will see now had been truly like a frontier one, with typical raids, guerrilla incursions, etc. And so, especially from the steppe, that it's just very close, like all different war bands could roam around, and it was very difficult to, of course, have a capillary territorial control. So you would have specific strongholds in strategic locations that were functional to the defense of the local community, that could take shelter inside them, and that could, generally speaking, like serve as an aggregation point, also for further structuring fortification. As such, they would become also the centers of powers of the margrave to exercise his, let's stress, royal prerogatives in virtue of his military mandate, that is the higher authority in that sense, the one of exercising violence. Courts were itinerant. They were also pretty modest at this point. Given the gradual process of decentralization, even during the resumption of an imperial scale, regional power like the Teutonian ones, many of these fortresses had emerged spontaneously. The existence of these strongholds was founded essentially on the right to fortification. That, however, still framed them as royal property, because, as we've seen, the margraves were essentially endowed with the same. And so, in theory, like this, fortresses could have been simply had, first of all, like in general, like during the public expeditions, of course, like the duchy, like all basically the local communities, to provide support to the imperial army, etc. And more concretely, however, they were subject to the jurisdiction, in fact, of the ruler, of his representative, and so mostly to the latter, unless even they were granted to others, which is what essentially starts happening ever more frequently in the following centuries, with the privatization and feudalization of Germany that had already like started, of course, but that would take the shape also with the development of the local communities, etc., in very much more complex ways, say territorial, other than a unitary direction. Yes, the tendency was unitary from these very fortresses around and clashing with other powers and the seigneurial competition, and it all mixed in a pretty turbulent regional context. The character of these strongholds as central hubs for the exercise of power by the royal official was mirrored, by the way, in the obligation of the population to provide for the maintenance of the castle structure. Of course, the local community had to contribute various means that we described, especially in the videos about seigneurial Europe, to the upkeeping of not just the castle, but say also other strategically relevant infrastructure like bridges, especially the same roads, and more. The defense against cavalry forces relied on this castle system. Most of the enemies were, as we've seen, steppe raiders in the early day, and a common feature shared by Austria and other border regions within the empire was, in fact, this constant infiltration from war bands that, as we've seen just yesterday in the video about Eurasian steppes tactics, were sort of very difficult to catch because they would disperse individually during the main onslaughts all across the territory to facilitate pillaging and essentially paralyzing the the defender's response that would be especially against lighter parties, like just to enclose themselves into fortifications, protecting the population, the cattle, and just like, of course, with on the occasion of the bulk of a large enemy army, to be counted in tens of thousands, like countering the likely siege operations of the invaders. that also tended to have some problems against the heavier Frankish cavalry in open field. Concurrently, throughout the Eastern Frankish kingdom, fortifications were constructed, especially from the 10th century onwards, also to repel the Magyar invasions that crossed the entire country. Right, the Magyars reached as far as Spain, southern Italy, northern France, and Germany was by far the most hit region of all, for reasons that are like also the Avars carried out raids into Merovingian Germany, etc. Like it's the most, it's the closest, most open Central European dimension. It facilitates that, but also, and especially I would say, the political fragmentation, the lack of an effective ruler until at least the rise of the Ottonians, who were properly elected to that imperial role to counter the Magyars, to put an end to their threat once for all, and successfully. And in other words, it was largely the same Eastern Frankish nobility's fault for allowing actually these enemies to enter, right, and addressing them, also directing them against some neighboring competitors within the same Eastern Frankish kingdom, etc. In spite of this broader process of encastellation, it remains debatable whether one can infer the existence of castle districts in Austria. This aspect is really relevant because there was a theory at some point that believed that this process of encastellation would be particularly orderly and literally splitting the entire territory on a hierarchical basis, whereas today we realize that it was a much less uniform and organized process. Much of it also was very spontaneous, and so not immediately connected to the feudal hierarchy that only in the later centuries would manage to have some sort of more homogeneous top control over the provincial dimension. There were some areas that were organized however, in a bit like this. For example, the Mark of Meissen, we haven't talked about this too much, in the northeast. Also parts of the Rhineland, especially the more developed, the ones that sort of allowed for a stronger power to rationalize like the local administration like that. So we do not see this as an early spatial organization principle for the Babenberg mark, right? With all residents assigned to specific castle centers. There is no evidence of this. A crucial indicator of the existence and scope of castle districts lies especially in the characteristic of the castle structure itself, right? According to a prevailing theory, that there is a royal official that could compel all freemen in his jurisdiction, including those with spiritual and secular immunities, to construct, maintain, and guard castles. And so if one assumes that castle districts served as this spatial organization principle for the entirety of the Ostmark, they would at least necessitate it to extend over the entire territory and requiring all residents to be assigned to specific castles. So in each case, when we look, for example, at the larger castles we mentioned above that are the nucleus of the margravial power, this would result in a sort of designated area within which residents were obligated, for example, to take refuge in the castle structure or castle guard, unless this obligation was replaced by monetary payments, which also would make, in fact, a great difference. And regarding this, these indicators, the Austrian evidence is limited, right? In other words, we do not have from the sources much about the relation between the population and the service owed, for example, like the Burgwerk, that the one to, in fact, upkeep the local fortifications, and also the military service itself. We have a first indirect evidence chronologically from a decree issued in 985-91, which essentially granted the colonists of the Passau estates general exemption from all vassal services to the margrave. And almost a century later, the bishopric of Freising received estates on the Magyar border in exchange for castle construction. So this evidence does not allow us, understandably, to determine whether these conditions were applicable to the entire Babenberg march. This was unlikely. However, we do gain two general points. The first is that the obligation to build a castle could extend beyond the immediate vicinity of the originary center of power that would have also been, centered on a castle. This is obviously the example from Passau, because the margrave in that sense would have was centered elsewhere, and thus the margravial authority was extended, at least before this exemption, to this, to the vassals, where those who owed the service from the lands of Passau. And the other is that this obligation did not necessarily have to be tied to a specific castle either when this was to be provided, as the Freising example also shows, because Freising was not on the frontier, but it received estates there, and the people living locally had to provide for the Burgwerk, the castle construction, which tells you already how more layered, shaded, and complex, of course, and articulated the situation was. It's only after more than half a century, say that until the mid-11th, that the castle district organization would have, however, ended, at least according to those who think that there was some initial connection, as we've seen, between the margravial district and the parcelization of the entire land according to Encastellation, and so down the hierarchical line, like the service owed to the margrave through this, basically by anyone through these castles, which again was unlikely. In fact, in contrast, we see that from records that can be that we get from later times mostly, the castles mentioned in the territory of the margravial territory began actually around this time, right? This is essentially also due to the fact that different parts of Europe underwent encastellation in a different time, and also was a fringe area that would essentially undergo this later in time. And these records reveal, in fact, that the claim to own such castles that appear can be traced back to royal grants up until the 13th century, right? So the process was still ongoing, basically until the end of the Babenberg period. In other words, what was happening is that Austria was developing, there were ever more castles and bigger ones built also in a hierarchical sense within this feudal hierarchy, and it's at that point that, in interest of political relevance, the margraves that were not, as we will see now, capable of actually controlling the entire territory, also from a military point of view, would recognize to such castles like that seigneurial dominion. Fundamentally, they had the local lords had already achieved on the surroundings of the same strongholds, right? Before this, things were much more empirically managed, and of course there was a great deal of political cooperation, but we do not see that aforementioned parcelization in different castles in an orderly sort of complete territorial fashion at all. We see for the margrave, as well as the later duke, as we've seen from the mid-12th century, that the right itself to margravial control over these castles basically had lost significance by the 12th century, because in parallel to this phenomenon, of course, say the country was now a wall. It was understood as Austria at this point was even elevated to the same ducal rank of Bavaria, and nobody was really much considering like the margravial power within, so as a signory among the others constituting the Ostmark and now duchy, to be vital for now the survival, for example, of the same territory that was not essentially threatened anymore, and the country was being elevated in this princely fashion, right? So what had actually happened in the meanwhile is that next to, of course, some margravial connections that had existed, the margraves, with these various vassals and their strongholds and their territorial pertinences, the margraves had relinquished themselves entirely some of these rights, or to transfer them to other spiritual or secular authorities, essentially by selling them, right, or purchasing this right, or creating other clientele connections with other lords, which is also quite interesting because the Babenberg dominion would actually grow to be one of the single most tidy, orderly, and best administered ones in the entire Europe. Right, the Babenberg dominions were the envy of so many princes and even the same kings and emperors. Right, everybody basically wanted to get Austria at some point, especially when the Babenberg were dying out dynastically. And as you know, it was a hell of a struggle. Right, the Swabians wanted that, the Bohemians, the Hungarians, the Habsburgs, and so it was a big deal. It was a compact, right, tough dominion. We've seen it just recently. So looking at Duke Leopold during the Third Crusade in the video about Conrad of Montferrat, the story of his enmity with Richard Lionheart and all the story that we all know. But we're talking about very high nobility. By the way, they were, as we've seen, all basically married into royalty, and with the same Montferrat, with the King of France, with the same King of Germany, Holy Roman Emperor. So, and the Babenberg house was a house of also of Crusader heroes, in fact. Great knights, as they were considered probably at the peak of that, at least more sort of individual sense of knighthood that we find, especially in the mid-12th century. We have examples, by the way, of the margravial relinquishing of such rights for his own, against some other benefit. In 1147, the right was granted, for example, to Klosterneuburg, in 1189 to Freising, in 1209 to Lilienfeld, and in 1217 to Melk. And you understand here the radical importance of ecclesiastical, like of spiritual powers that were also just like more reliable than the secular ones, because they had sort of more privileges. Essentially, they would get this. They would become, of course, more powerful ecclesiastical principalities. I have a video incoming, by the way, just about the medieval German bishops and how warlike they were. But of course, relinquishing these rights to a spiritual authority was better, because they had different ways of, let's say, of maintaining it, also not splitting it. And fundamentally, the spiritual authorities were limited also in the powers that they could exercise, also in an autonomous military sense. And this was essentially tending these principalities to back actually the central authority, in this case the ducal one, at least here after 1156, before it would have been the margrave one, but we're talking about the same thing. As it happened basically at all level of the feudal hierarchy, like the great ecclesiastical princes of the realm were backing the monarchy, and so down the line, because they feared to be bullied and taken over by the lay nobility. It was very violent, as we will see now, and order, central authority was needed. Meanwhile, the Counts of Falkenstein had already received the castle as a fief from the Duke for their Austrian property, and similar conclusions can be drawn from the Melk document regarding the sovereign's bailiffs, and from the Lilienfeld one regarding the ministeriales of Altenburg. We will talk in a while about the ministeriales. As you know, I have a pretty hefty playlist about them. You know what we're talking about. These were essentially servant knights that had emerged, as we'll see now, in the earlier times as subordinates, actually as a B-series kind of soldier, that, however, by the 13th century, especially in southern Germany, and so this areas, in fact, were some of the best example of that, would reach the 90% of total knights, and actually being indistinguishable from them, in some cases actually being even more powerful than the free nobility. Right? If you look at the time Rudolf of Habsburg, Ottokar II took over Austria, like the ministeriales were the backbone of the local military. Today we don't arrive there. As you know, I wrote a master thesis on exactly on that topic, but one day, in fact, I will give you a bit more evidence for that. I have also something coming on 13th century Bohemia, and we'll have fun. I have a video on the seal of Ottokar II. It's these times. Now, the diminished importance of the at least single castle to the sovereign may be attributed to also a shift in the very function of this stronghold, specifically the transformation into a sort of manorial castle, which entailed the separation of the stronghold from the town. In other words, these were sort of more private possessions that, as we've seen, had just because of the lack of centralization ended up in the hands of some lords that didn't want to mess up necessarily with the sort of the public prerogatives connected with, for example, the local markets or something like that. So they were sort of shifting themselves, like trying to move their position away from that threat to the central authority that they didn't quite need to do, because they preferred just to, in fact, consolidate their power privately and escaping partially in that sense, hoping to be co-opted anyway. And coinciding with this change, a phenomenon of replacing, by the way, the castle dues, like to what was normally exacted from the local subjects for its upkeep, was a military payment. Essentially, this was, of course, all one with the military service that the margravial ducal vassals had to provide in terms of proper men in arms, as we will see now. But at this point, such service could be and would be commuted with monetary payments for hiring mercenaries and or just paying vassals to sort of make them move, or as far as this was the most modern, updated, and effective functional way of levying like a considerable force. You see, the documents are not explicit, but here we are essentially between the end of the 11th and the first half of the 14th century. Leopold, by the way, was canonized and became the patron saint of Austria. This later in the 15th century, but was a key figure here. And you see how early, after all, this phenomenon was there. It was surely not the first time the margraves had proceeded in this way. In Conrad III's chart, here we're talking Conrad's King of Germany, first half of the 12th century charter for Klosterneuburg, a distinction is made between the Justitia of the margravial Foldrum and the opera, or basilatic services extracted from the monasteries, colonies, Klosterneuburg. These are all very important, names, like also a bit like the Habsburgic mystic, but really had come to compose the ducal territory over time, like this. And this distinction is very important, right? Because the same one, so between Justitia of the margravial Foldrum and the servitium of the castle in Duke Henry II. We'll understand what these mean. The margravial Foldrum was essentially like that, essentially royal prerogative of, in fact, access to the military supply, like to properly the horse fodder for the, in fact, mounted expeditions, as we will see now, were practically the backbone of the margravial military activity itself. We find a less clear distinction between the Justitia of the margravial fodder and the servitium of the castle in Duke Henry II's document for Freising. We are in 1164, because servitium can be referred to both payment and service, right? And the combination of both services, the margravial fodder and essentially the castle upkeeping, under the rubric of Justitia in Frederick Barbarossa's diploma of 1189, can be seen, in fact, as evidence for the eventual conversion of the castle upkeeping, the Burgwerk, into a tax, just like in part like the military service in money, right? This was an issue also probably in the Kingdom of Germany. The more distant lands in the northeast, especially, the second half of the 12th century would contribute rather than with actual soldiers, with money, right, to for example, the Roman expedition of the Holy Roman Empire. I mean, the expeditions into Italy were not very popular, and in fact, that's where you understand why so much involvement of the clergy, why so much of this service actually being relinquished to the ecclesiastical principalities that were also the ones to make the greatest use of ministeriales, together with the monarch, right? These guys were probably the enforcers, the iron fists. I mean, extremely violent and incredibly efficient people at their job. So it's likely no coincidence that the castle upkeeping has been also proven to be in function as a tax in Styria around the same time, second half of the 12th century. The later references to the Burgberg in the 13th century, as found, for example, in Melk, right, and in the Principality of Urbar, unequivocally refer to monetary payments in exchange for the service. Unfortunately, we do not know better what happened in the entirety of the mark/duchy when we talk about these services, because as we've seen, there is no evidence for a uniformly patterned castle districtuation across Austria. We know that, of course, there are castles serving as central hubs of power in relation to the surrounding territory that were systematically distributed throughout the region. They were used like that. This is exemplified by the Kreisen line in the Babenberg mark, not all areas can be attributed to a castle's sphere of influence, particularly in the early period, understandably. And that's where we have to go back a bit to the ministeriales as well, and also a bit back in time. So I made multiple videos explaining how, following the reign of Pippin III, in the in Frankish times, the heavily armored cavalry gradually became the dominant component of the army. This was already true actually before him. It's true since the second half of the 6th century, right? But of course the ratio of cavalry and infantry power was more balanced before. This rather opens to a point of further significant decline in the importance of infantry capabilities compared to before, which should also not overestimate the resulting material demands for this heavily armored cavalry, particularly the ownership of horses and armor, but especially like the energies, like the resources properly for the continuous lifelong training became increasingly burdensome for the majority of the freemen as the frequency of wars increased. The Eastern Frankish kingdom has all a history of even of revolt against this initial introduction of the vassalic beneficiary system. The Carolingians were pioneering the same Saxon resistance can be read like that. The Stellinger revolt. There's also this almost absurd traditional solution of the freemen aligning themselves with the slaves to counter the aristocracy. In any case, the latter wins, right? So this led to the restriction of participation in offensive military campaigns. It is military service proper to the wealthier segments of the population. For the remaining freemen, their sole obligation was to defend the land in times of emergency or to pay a contribution. It was, in most of the cases, consensual. Right? This especially is evident during probably after the collapse of the Carolingian Empire. The seigneurial bank, and say Encastellation derived from as we've seen, the Burgwerk, the contribution of the peasantry to that military structuring, mostly managed by the elite, but so the peasantry had retained some military capacity. Should never be like they had been completely obliterated, right? That rather something occurring in the later Middle Ages. Meanwhile, this development laid ground, however, for the probably sort of class-based separation would ultimately restrict the number of the freemen who were initially obligated to serve in the army proper. We think that some of them would have been disarmed by law to some, at least in some circumstances. And in the 10th century, as you know, properly there is a military class that basically is identical. It's recognized across the entire post-Carolingian world. It's what Western Europe at large becomes, also famous for. And as the heavily armored cavalry became the core of the army, there was an increased need, of course, for a well-trained, continuously operational group of professional warriors, as these milites technically were. And this need was met by incorporating vassalage into the army's constitutional system, or as well as being probably the political one. And from this point on, the levy, right, was directed not only at the counts, but also directly at the royal vassals and nobles who had their own vassals. This included serfs as well, right, that who gained the opportunity to ascend through the ranks during such expeditions, a process that essentially opened the path. It's the same one that brings to the emergence of the ministeriales themselves. And in Charlemagne's time, the old royal army and vassal levy had sort of coexisted relatively equally. Right? So you had, again, the idea that all the free, able-bodied men would have to, at least eligible for military service, that would be levied to some extent. And then you had this more professional corps of mounted, heavily armored warriors that were increasingly taking over at so many levels, like strategically, logistically, and were entrusted properly by the government with the means to sustain themselves in that lifestyle, in that capacity. From the late Carolingian times, the latter became increasingly prominent and really the norm for military campaigns in post-Carolingian times, as early as the 10th century, of course. And the association between military service in the form of heavy cavalry and membership of the nobility, or the aristocracy, say better at this point, bound to the king by vassal loyalty, remained intact since then, right? Nobility is something that, of course, can be explained at many anthropological, religious, metaphysical levels, and there is, of course, a higher aristocracy at this point that, is more important. Like, say, the margravial, the ducal one is, of course, that is the higher nobility, so-called. But the milites, as a whole, there is not a dramatic social certification like in later feudal times. So basically, all milites felt to be almost equal, right, in their status and condition. And it was a very fluid dynamic. In any case, they were all separated from the rest of the population. In fact, the non-vassal pagenses, so basically the villagers, those who lived in the pageant, especially in Eastern Francia, that was, basically the least developed part of the empire, like the least urbanized, etc., continued to be used at best as light cavalry, which is not to be underestimated, especially in the Ostmark, right, in the frontier, close to the steppe, fighting against mostly light horsemen, and auxiliary troops as well, on foot, right, or even as servants, like field aides, like pioneers, the troops, let's say, people devoted to logistical services and so on, unless their position was contested by the unfree entourage of vassals and ministeriales. Now, when military operations required mobility and the implementation of a spatial strategy over long distances, whether it was formally agreed upon military campaign or a counterattack to defend against enemy attacks, the presence of a mounted and essentially armored troop was an indispensable prerequisite. We've seen it in the video that I made about the Ottonian army organization. We know that at the peak of their power, the Ottonians could levy 20,000 milites, which is actually a lot, like in terms of regional power. The ministeriales would essentially contribute to oust the rest of the freemen, right, from the military service. This through their own masters, but in this sense, rising as more important and powerful individuals, even though they were serfs and unfree men, but over the rest of the population as a military clientele. We'll see now. And again, the video on, I made so many videos about the ministeriales, but if you want to look at the roots of this, there is, regarding especially the service, that some milites agrarii, for example, so were owed to the local lord, upkeeping and garrisoning local fortifications. Like, you are invited, of course, to check out the aforementioned video on the Ottonian army organization. In the 10th and in the 11th centuries, all military campaigns led by the Germanic rulers in France, Italy, or Hungary consistently referred to cavalry armies. According to the available sources, these armies were typically formed by the levies of the nobility and the ministeriales, that were also, again, those who essentially would have the means to move over such long spaces. Of course, they would be supported by different types of troops depending on where they were, mostly local ones, because as we've seen, the outer levies didn't even have fundamentally the means to move very far from their localities. And as mentioned earlier, cavalry service and aristocracy are closely intertwined in terms of origin, since the strategy of cavalry combat had a aristocratic forming effect in return. Right, and at this point it was consolidated. So during the reign of the Austrian margrave Henry I, who died in 1018, there was a discussion concerning the militia sue primatibus, which in Latin refers to the prominent nobleman in his vassal entourage, and with a small retinue of no more than 30 heavily armored men, comprising vassals and servants, his successor Adalbert observed the attacking Magyars in 1042 before a force of 300 nobiles et fortes, so noble and strong, assembled to engage the enemy. And this aspect is interesting because it shows you how small these forces were. Right here we look at the full complement. You have this vanguard, 1/10 of the larger force, but we're essentially talking of just 300 milites. Naturally, there would have been some foot auxiliary in larger numbers, and this is unfortunately what we tend not to know until very late in time. For the Battle of Markfeld in 1278, we know that there was plenty of infantrymen, but we don't hear of them. Right? During this major battle, it was actually the largest battle in terms of the number of feudal knights involved in history. So we should actually think of this as a more structured force, not just heavy cavalry, that being just the core, right, the shock element, the predominant, but not yet the completely decisive one at this point in history, right? Especially in Germany, there is, first of all, a slower development of feudalism, and secondly, the local terrain was often pretty unsuited for mounted combat, so much so that the militaries tended to dismount, fight behind streams, river. It is true that, again, in Austria there was more open ground, also in this frontier context that borders with Bohemia, with Hungary, but there were also quite marshy areas and still also forested ones, so this would apply a bit. But indeed, if we have to look at the area of Germany that made more use of not necessarily heavily armored cavalry, but mounted warfare, probably this is the one, because you have to account, as we will see now, in this raiding warfare on the eastern frontier, also some, and the possibility of some peasant, like proper levy military service on horseback, which of course would have been limited considering the world population, but still was needed to cope against like lighter horsemen, for example, of the Hungarian type. Nobility and ministeriales also formed the core of the force defeated by the Bohemians and the Moravians at Meilberg in 1082. The testimony of feudal or servant men of the counts of Formbach, Ratelenberg, and the monastery of St. Florian, as well as the course of the battle described in the Vita Altmanni. Altmann was bishop of Passau between 1065 and 1091, provides further evidence of this phenomenon, because according to the latter account, both sides initially clashed with javelins and spears before resorting to swords. This was quite typical of the time. If you look at the Battle of Hastings, around the same time, you see that the very developed Norman and so essentially Western Frankish heavy cavalry still skirmished, like had spears / javelins to throw against the Anglo-Danish shield wall before charging into it. The couché lance grip, the convoy tactics, the thickly packed formation had not yet been fully sort of develop, right? Still at this point, and this would have been also truer a bit for places like Austria. So these clashes, as we've seen, were also relatively contained in number, which exalted a bit the individual, right, the warrior still, compared to other more drilled collective contexts. On the one hand, these accounts suggests a cavalry battle, while on the other, javelins and lances are also weapons typically associated with the nobility, was used like that of heavy armor was likely unfamiliar or even prohibited for peasants. What did these knights, protagonists of these battles, look like? Well, there is nothing, again, particularly specific about Austria in the essentials. The earliest visual representations of the noble warrior of the local area can be traced back to the 12th century, and there is not really too much, right? Specifically, we have to look at the equestrian seals, as well as other isolated illustrations found in manuscripts, illuminations of the time of the Babenbergs. These depictions show the warrior armed with the typical conical helmet, like coat of mail, spear, sword. The helmet was replaced by the pot type in the second half of the 12th century. Is depicted both with or without a nose guard. This is completely normal. A notable feature is the hauberk, protecting the back of the head, neck, and throat. I can imagine that actually in this southeastern German frontier, a bit more of care for neck protection was present. This tends to happen in the areas that are characterized by, let's say, at least an enemy making wide use of horse archery. We can see a beautiful representation of these knights in the seal attributed to Leopold III. In contrast to later depictions, the shields of the early Babenbergs featured the typically long, narrow, triangular shape of the time, right? High shape that basically reaches from the armpit, right? The shoulder is a bit exposed, but it's armored anyway, to approximately halfway down the shin, which also shows actually how the Austrian infantry was probably not tender, right? Wasn't like a particularly developed foot force. We don't have evidence of stronger communal phenomena or particularly affluent or autonomous peasantry. But as we'll see now, the foot soldiers could be quite nasty, also in an anti-cavalry function. And so this area, of course, of Europe witnesses the same development of, of the shield as a drop with the reverse, like with the more acute and extending to cover the thigh. Additionally, stirrups are clearly visible on the seals. These were essentials for riders clad in heavy armor, as you know. Like also in this, like the Austrians followed the same chronology. Stirrups existed for quite a while, but now they're becoming fully generalized, right? For allowing a much better shock absorption during this ever increasingly more collective cavalry charges that need at some point the knights even to be tied to the saddle, not to be catapulted from the horse on impact. The surcoat as a means of distinction and also for this more collectively tactical reasons appears to have been in use in Austria as early as the 12th century. It is worth noting that there is no evidence of armor of horses during this period, which is also normal, right? At most it would have been some padded barding, but iconographically we don't get much of that. And the reason is simple, like the shock force represented by cavalry in itself was just enough to overwhelm any kind of lighter missile element that could sort of cause, say, excessive damage to the horses that did suffer casualties normally in this type of warfare, but that is enough. Like, cavalry charges are not stopped by missile. In the narrative sources of the 11th to 12th century, heavily armored men are mentioned only once in the context of the Ostmark. However, their presence is not unusual, of course, for this period. It's consistent with the patterns observed throughout the empire and in Western Europe in general. This tells you how, say, documents are not, of course, satisfactory. Most of the time, the evidence is reduced, but of course, like, Austrians fought pretty much with the same, military organization of post-Carolingian Europe, and the heavily armored were so obviously there that also wasn't even needed to be stressed. Like, that was the only way to make war, fundamentally, in that tactical segmentation. Moreover, say that those hauberks would have been, as we pointed out already, very useful to successfully resist any force, right? Also the considerable one of mounted archers, but mostly they were developing because of the increasingly shock capacity of the same Western knights that really fought routinely among one another. We will see now with the feuds and all. And really the nature of the frontier wasn't changing too much. Like, we're not focusing now specifically on that. But as you know, the Germans at some point in the centuries invaded Hungary. There were always border skirmishes, these raids. It's as if in many ways things had not really changed excessively. Of course, there weren't the Magyar invasions of the centuries before. Those had been put down exactly by the superior military model, but say that more or less the Hungarians took their time before delving, just like the Scandinavians that, realized that Britain is too tough of a nut to crack. They simply readdressed their piratic activities towards the Baltic, the Baltic Crusades. Now, the heavily armed cavalry had a significant advantage in close combat, especially against the lighter Magyar and sometimes also Slavic cavalry, because these peoples actually were developing the same thing that had always had a heavily armored component, but on average they were lighter than the Germans. It would be the Germans that, as a broader military cultural terms, would actually, in fact, westernize the Western Slavs, the Hungarians. Magyar cavalry had historically specialized in mobile warfare, long-range combat, relying primarily on bows and arrows as the primary weapon, which was ultimately just by military and societal organization, like a proof of general weakness. So that shock force was enough, right, to break the Magyar raids into Germany and even to pass on the offensive into Hungary. In contrast, and exactly for this reason, German archers were sparingly employed, mainly for siege warfare, defense of fortified positions. They were actually, like I can think, even, especially in Austria, more numerous in relative terms than in other parts of the empire. This is where I expect them to have been actually more numerous. Maybe not the most punching ones, say the more technical development of the crossbow, etc., would have not necessarily concentrated there, but the necessity of having to cope with this more step-flavored type of enemy, and the lighter type of enemy in the first place, of someone who was, softer to hit, and or at least, also more relying on skirmishers that are to be countered in that way. As we were saying, sources do not care very much about the lesser elements of the army, but it's obvious that in siege warfare, especially missile force was needed to suppress the enemies on the battlements, to allow the militaires to act as stormtroopers, seizing the strongholds. This is why on the frontier, and likely because of the Magyar influence, archery became more prevalent from the 12th century onwards. Southeastern Germany develops in the later centuries an important amount of mounted archery, crossbowmen, especially in this Slavo, Magyar, German area, especially probably in the south of Austria rather than Austria. It is a bit more probably Western in outlook. We'll be covering this because you don't actually find it in the rest of Germany, and it's evenly connected with that, step frontier. And then there are other places. I have something not incoming but planned about German archery during the Middle Ages. There is famous Thuringen archer represented. It's a beautiful manuscript illumination from the Liber ad Honorem Augusti, which is actually a southern Italian work, but it represents there's a lot of German influence there, representing the Thuringen archer in a particular attire, and that will surely come to fill our historical military unit playlist. But it's also just a more generic type of archer. Again, there aren't many types of archers really at this time. All right. Of course, there were longbowmen for the bigger sized type, etc. But we see maybe again this slightly greater missile warfare in southeastern Germany, but everything fits more or less the broader Western dimension. Despite their relative rarity, German archers remained secondary warriors and were possibly composed mainly of peasants, thereby highlighting a connection between armament and social structure. But do not underestimate some picked units that always existed, throughout all Western Europe. When you look at also mounted crossbowmen, etc., you realize that they were few but well paid, well kept, etc. So this may have been the case, but we don't see. It was again a rude, a rough place, right? And so you don't expect much tactical sophistication either. It was a very feudal land, as we'll see now, pretty brutally equestrian and aristocratic one. But hey, never underestimate the tactical adaptation capacity. So anybody involved, all right. So the notion that the peasantry played a significant role in the war effort warrants further examination for Austria as well, because a striking example of the importance of non-aristocratic warriors can be seen in the account about the clash at Mailberg, which highlights actually some participation in national levies of more humble fighters that had been evidently summoned, called up during times of emergency, such as in the event of a national succession crisis at Similia. But this would have been really normal, right? You don't have to think that an average peasant was so distant from arms, right? Also because, as we've seen also in a recent video about pole arms, if we look now to what we get actually from the accounts about the Austrian peasantry, the brutally traumatic capacities of an angry and desperate peasant on the battlefield does not to be underestimated. Cosmas of Prague, this Bohemian chronicler living between 1045 1125, reports, albeit with some bias and literary embellishment, that even, in fact, these individuals from humble backgrounds, including pig farmers and cattle herders, were mobilized in Austria to fight alongside the mounted aristocracy, and armed with an array of iron weapons, right? So mostly stemming from agricultural tools, that are, however, pretty nasty. Like the Ols, for example, that is the Allspies, the Alpike, which is an effective anti-cavalry weapon, probably to stop cavalry charges. The Bohemians had similar armies to the ones of the Germans, but generally speaking, they were lighter, right? Bohemia is the Western Slavic country that, like the country in Central Europe, that really gets most of the German influence. And goads that would be essentially billhooks, right? They're similar to the ones that were used to by the elephant mahouts to grapple with one another. And those would have been instead made, again, multiple videos about medieval arms and armor, explaining how, like, the first ranks of the infantry, like, to stop cavalry, needed pikes. So here the Halspies was optimal. And then the posterior ranks, the immediately posterior ranks, at least because this would be a few better equipped ones than you had probably the meltaways, and times even literally unarmed, just to make mass psychological. Peasantry equipped with this pole arms, like in traumatic weapons, in this case billhooks, were particularly good at pulling the horsemen down once the cavalry charge had been successfully absorbed and stopped. And that's the most dangerous moment of vulnerability of cavalry, the moment after the charge has been stopped. Right. So, again, some Bohemian melees would have, gone through pretty bad 5 minutes during that battle anyway. And this evidence is reinforced by the wording of the aforementioned Vita Altmanni, Bishop of Passau, where you find during the expedition the term cum omni populo suo, which obviously speaks of this, people, commoners that were to be, and omni here it referred to that sort of general levy mass. So it implies the involvement, at least of peasant troops, say on a regular basis, I would say, in the Austrian army. Now, this phenomenon is not unique, of course, to these particular instances. It's been documented in earlier instances during the Magyar invasions in the frontier areas, where the local populations were typically called upon to defend against the threat. Right? I talked recently about the Krajina, the video about the Habsburgic Hungary during the 16th century. How, generally speaking, that was always a place where the peasantry was used. It was used in the guise of military colonists, really, because there weren't so many infrastructures or even like surplus capacities to really defend the entire territory. And so the population had already sort of provided for their defense, like very modest means. I mean, palisades, entrenchments, ditches, some local militia, like picking this agricultural tools turned into weapons, right, and trying to resist their best, like until some greater force would arrive. Naturally, this one was really one of the single most traumatically violent context that we can imagine. Doesn't get much. We don't get much information, but I can say that this happens very much in frontier areas. We've seen it in the marches in Italy. We've seen it also in a way in the Ditmarsch, and I have a video counting on those. That the places where apparently less is going on in terms of documentation, and also bigger military activity, actually hides in relative terms a disproportionate level of local violence because of the lack of order, the lack of a broader stability. Now, as we were saying, like the Babenberg duchy would flourish and develop in one of the tiniest places in Europe. But again, this was also thanks to the fact that it had been well administered through this political territorial control stemming from essentially a novel land, reorganized, recolonized, like directed from the top, and part of the Ostsiedlung in that fresh, rejuvenating fashion. Furthermore, evidence suggests that peasant warriors were also deployed during the Magyar wars fought under Henry IV's reign, So we're talking about Holy Roman Emperor, 1056-1084, as exemplified by isolated cases with his reign. And of course, in order to fight from Franconia to Hungary, well, the launchpad was Austria. And so local levies, as we were saying before, at a relatively short distance would have been involved to invade, say, Upper Hungary, even deeper into the Hungarian territory. And of course, there were means from the nobility to, of course, logistically support the use of these infantries at also hundreds of kilometers, of course. There's also the famous Battle of Leitha in 1246. So we're later we'll see the context of this battle between Bela IV of Hungary and the Duke Frederick II of Austria. And the Hungarian army was routed, but the Duke Frederick was killed. So this actually ended also the Austrian claims to the western counties of Hungary. It was a pretty bloody battle, where you see a vast, innumerable multitude of common folk perishing alongside a significant portion of the nobility. So it's evident how noblemen were also involved in the battle. By the way, we are in the mid-13th century, a bit at the peak of probably of the resources. So here would have been an exemplary feudal army with the cream of the heavily armored shock cavalry, and then this other lighter component sustaining it. And the commoner's presence is indeed to be expected also in non-fighting capacity, for example in the baggage train, as accompanying attendants. But of course they would also make mass during the battle in different ways. It cannot be definitely determined from strictly Austrian sources whether these peasant groups engage in combat on foot or horseback. As we were saying before, like my take is of course that they were mostly, well, my take, it's pretty obvious, like it would be mostly on foot, right? But again, there had been a time in which even the peasantry was mobilized on horseback, and we have to understand a bit, however, who they were, because they weren't the average peasant indeed, and so there was a further form of organization. There's a passage in Cosmas suggesting that the Bohemian cavalry dismounted and fought on foot during the Battle of Mailberg, indicating that they were likely confronted by infantry. Not only, right, there were different ways where they could dismount, but in general they were infantry, and so the Germans may have done in the same way. And again, we may easily think that was some peasant in Austria owing military service on horseback. We see also that Austrian warfare develops quite gradually. Anyway, there is no particular turning point. We see that thus the political and social development went in parallel with that. We do not see something like a general cavalry levy prior to the 11th century, because, as we've seen, the margravial power was also limited up to that point, and the word difficulty is probably in coordinating the entire forces in Austria unitarily. The phenomenon of cavalry service had already become, by this point, a characteristic feature of the milites, though with the social differentiation from the time of the Carolingians at the earliest, and it would be interesting to see at the Bavarian society and warfare of the previous centuries as well, because that's of course already showing something similar. Furthermore, the development of the ministeriales did not bring about any alterations in combat techniques either, right? Nor the organization of the cavalry army, including aspects such as supply chain management for the margravial fodder stocks, as we've seen. Everything had been working pretty linear, obvious way, right? The capacity also of the ministeriales to gradually become in a strictly military technical sense just identical, virtually indistinguishable from the the noble knights by the 13th century. Just tell you how it took half of a millennium or something to arrive there. A local defense surely underwent a transformation as a result of the literal expansion of Austria towards Bohemia and Hungary during the Austrian and specifically the shift occurred from the border castles inherited from the Carolingian period that would remain thus in the rare areas as the expansion progressed, compared to the newly established margravial ones under, for example, the reign of Henry III. There was here we can't sort of digress on everything, but of course the German kings were involved in the sort of arrangement of the margraviate and the duchy. So Henry III, we are 1046, 1056, and there was a work under him to further organize this military frontier as it was expanding, and so coordinating, as we were saying before, sort of also more scientific, rational, if you want, strategic distribution of the new castles or the new settlements, because a lot of colonization was going on with that. Well, literally, you have Germany expanding towards that direction. Now, the development of Austria and the rise of the ministeriales can be identified in this 11th century as the expression of a deliberate strategy, as we were just saying, enabling a more extensive spatial, military colonization of the territory, right? The ministeriales were enhanced during this period exactly because they were the sort of military colonists that were servants. They were expandable in some way, even though they were valuable. This was in comparison to the nobility, of course, and so you would use them as these initially sort of medium-type troop that, however, was ever more skilled, also thanks to this experience matured out there. And this development, in a sense, rendered, as we've seen, the earlier large castles unnecessary, as they were no longer just the only fortification, properly the military presence in the area, right? Smaller castles were growing, like further complicating local politics, as we've seen, but also stiffening the military presence locally, and especially the ministeriales that, as we've seen in Austria, would reach up to 90% of the entire knights. The ministeriales undoubtedly played this crucial role in the defense, properly, of the frontier. Yet it's reasonable to assume that the farmers were also involved, like potentially contributing to the same evolution of such Austrian ministeriality. The numerous small ministerial estates in the feudal area, for example, may serve as an indication of this involvement. Because a century before, in the well-documented Milites Agraria of Henry the Fowler, we find an example of how the functions of warrior and farmer did not have to be mutually exclusive. Actually, the ministeriales had been born exactly like that. So we're dealing, for sure, with a parallel rather than a succession of distinct forms of military organization. Essentially, some peasants settled in border areas were told, look, 1 out of 4, if I'm not wrong of you, has to leave into this fortified placement, and the collectivity has to contribute to its upkeeping and garrison it for military purpose. This was a way of socially promoting part of these people, at least gradually establishing like some more capillary control at the territorial level. If you look at, say, certain fortifications the ministeriales lived in, they were literally just some still survived. Like they were like incredible claustrophobic towers in the midst of nowhere. Right? This is sort of think about the Acritae in the Byzantine world, and the spaces were also different from, of course, the castle as we imagine it a bit in a romantic sense, but they would also lead this rude life in nature, in danger, right, and yet tempering themselves almost in a monastic sense in this uncontaminated nature. I mean, think about how Austria could look, right? Even more fascinating than today, back in, say, the 11th century. And in the group of milites, which would later become this closed class, right? They were becoming Ottoman times, but the boundaries between this way of life and that of peasants remained relatively fluid during the 13th century. At least in Germany, because of this role of servant knights that had to do with different societal development in Germany, namely, again, the lack of surplus of resources, so the necessity of starting properly from the population to elevate people of very low status, in fact, even an unfree one, to some level of militarization and cooptation. Now, the idea that farmers played a direct role in defending the border that we described before could potentially account also for the scarcity of references to the margravial feudum in Austria, right? Especially if one considers the feudum as a substitute for the original real contribution to military service. In other words, if you are to serve actively as a military colonist, you will be exempted from like this important sort of heavy provision that, as you understand, was presented properly the fodder for heavy cavalry, right? And margravial fodder here, the fodder was really a royal public prerogative, so the margravate had really been entrusted with it because of its imminent strategical seriousness, right? And in this sense, the margraves had established these conditions also for the local communities to in fact subcontract in some way. And the feudum is, for example, seen as a contribution made by the church servientes, so technically serfs, who were exempt from military service and were required to support the army in Austria. So this is interesting. There's a specific document telling us that. So this makes us see how the margravial fodder was not collected in areas where the original obligation to serve personally in the military remained in effect. And we can be fairly sure of this commutation, especially probably on the outer frontier, where people were also just consuming. There were poorer areas, by the way, so it was also a way, just not an incredibly functionally efficient way, but just like these people were barely surviving out there. They were working hard, and they essentially required this extra just to be robust enough, also to provide this minimum of defense. It's obvious that whichever organized enemy would have used in a proper expedition, like that level of, say, the scale of force and level of elite professionalism that some military farmers would have not been able to cope with. But since there were lots of raiders as well, and we find it properly even within Hungary, for example, I mean, a bit about 12th century Hungary, I mean, average laws were something like, specific penalties for random raiders who passed by on horseback, abducting virgins that were at that point, they were obliged by law to marry, or to bring back to their parents. So that's the kind of divide that also existed between the German and the Hungarian side. There are also some anthropological characters that can help us understand better what especially the Babenberg warfare was. Like, we see this like between the 11th, the 13th century, some really interesting information about especially the nobility, right? We see minor events such as border disputes or personal insults frequently escalating into fighting. This is really typical of the European nobility of the time. There's a great political fragmentation. These lords have emerged essentially as mobsters from their respected seigneuries, and they have all that kind of loaded sort of mafia mentality of authority, of honor, not taking anything from anyone, and they are that radically violent. Right, that episode about the Hungarians, it's not that in Austria you wouldn't have some of these very guys abducting fresh pucelles for their more primal instincts, but of course, like, there is a bit more regulation, because after all, and we've made multiple videos about this, it's also true, this order of violence actually, that if you actually, we like maybe to make things a bit more emotional here, but truthfully, and this is what you really see when you study in detail all these feuds, is that, as incomprehensible to some of us that would seem, actually, that when we contextualize them politically, they make an awful lot of sense, right? They were all fighting to actually consolidate their own patrimony, to invest. Like, that was the way of doing it, right? Because of the general instability, the fact that if you simply sat there, you would have unavoidably been worn out. And so actually great part of the Babenberg success was connected with this kind of lifestyle, just as the one of many other Austrian houses, right? And we've seen also from the numbers that the conflicts themselves rarely exceeded the scope of a feud, right? Leading to argue against even historiographically a fundamental distinction between a war and a feud. Because there was a sense of general war, yes, especially the ones that the king, the emperor would call, right, were great perturbations crossing Germany in these generations. Think about the investiture struggle, the city excommunication. Like, it was really a pretty turbulent reality, and Austria, the Ottoman, this wedged really into, in fact, that, as we've seen, Hungarian and Western Slavic war was always also about a lot of dialogue actually with those areas, especially the Bohemia and Moravia. So it's really much more dynamic now politically than when I'm making it, that we will make better history about this period in Germany, in Bohemia, in Hungary. Still, trust the cycle. Some of you has learned to accept, right, patiently and faithfully. So pillaging and looting are, needless to say, key features of warfare during this period. Even for holy figures like the aforementioned Margrave Leopold that was made saint. Actually, I have a video about Gérald de Vaurilhac that I like to remember often. It's a very old video, but it actually talks about secular and even military seigneurial holiness in slightly this was a biography of a Auvergnian nobleman written by Adolphe Cluny, so we're just a couple of centuries before, but as we've seen, things wouldn't change excessively much in the mentality, so that was exactly it. Except I would argue that the Ostmark was slightly more primitive, violent, savage in many ways, so also this Teutonic furor would have been more pronounced, especially in this massive baths of blood. You can imagine, like, surrounded, knights fighting, surrounded by, I don't know, hordes of, of Magyars, of Slavs, like, exciting these men's fantasies regarding the Nibelungenlied impersonation and, all the various commixtions of terribly beautiful, also artistic content, right? Remember the idea of the warrior bard, and this was pretty much, think about the Minnesänger, Bavaria, also were some of the most important centers, as you know. Now, the aim of plundering and bringing back as much booty as possible often imbues battles in the border frontier with a character more akin to great raids than carefully planned military operations. This also tells you why some commoners would join anyway. It was completely normal when some mess was occurring, even maybe because an enemy had destabilized the area, maybe to just participate to the plunder, not to lose the chance to get something out of it, even if it was against your side, right? These are, so real things. Again, unfortunately, here the sources are silent regarding so many details, but life was running. And there is all an individual ethos that we can grasp from the elite that indeed, in a knightly sense, was very high. Bravery and personal strength did determine, like individually, the outcome of battles. This is typical of the smaller engagements. As we have seen, remember that the smaller the force, the more varied the outcome can be, the more unpredictable one. Even one guy can do excessive things. Of course, like there is a statistics for that, for which things tend to be balanced, but the deed of a single hero like can really achieve a lot, and this is also what they were all kind of excited about. And there are, interestingly, some anthropometric studies conducted on the skeletons of the very early Babenbergs as human types, which suggests that these Bavarian noblemen were physically imposing individuals who towered over the rest of the population. Right, the physicality of that was insane. Right, you still haven't made properly a video explaining this in a technical, like in a physical sense, but indeed these were some of the finest and again most shockingly violent people you could find. Like, incredibly strong, resilient. They knew, of course, it wasn't much about being just big. Like, if you were being selected brutally like that throughout the generations, they had to withstand extreme stress in shocking circumstances. But it was also about all the technicality, the collective training, the charges, like the right moment in which to attack, and then an incredible physical power. And yes, it's really true. Like the medieval elite was that genetically superior to the rest. In contrast, attempts to formalize warfare seem to have been of secondary importance, at least until the 12th century, where there is a bit more of regulation. There is also a bit of a lock of the nobility, so that, as we've seen here, pretty much every milas had been a nobleman of some sort, because in theory even every freeman in arms was a nobleman of some sort traditionally. But the gradually, especially like with the hierarchical structuring of the duchy, like that is elevated itself, in fact, with the privilegium minus in 1156, and separated as such from Bavaria, because that was the point. That this was a mark of within the broader Bavarian duchy was something enormous. Like it technically encompassed like the entire southeastern Germany, even northeastern Italy, all the lands in between. We've seen Tyrol. In theory, that was all Bavaria, and that there is a lot of history there. I explained it in the video about the Duchy of Bavaria. And these were not historically, like, at least entirely, ethnic Bavarian lands, right? Austria was, good part of the Alpine arc was in the east, but in other areas were molded essentially by Bavarian colonists in the southeast. So it's a bit of a complex story, but everything formalizes in feudal culture, especially towards the third quarter of the 12th century, including these repartitions that become truly more functional. The Babenberg duchy is a real principality, and Austria is a pretty happy place at this point compared to the other, say, European feudal standards. And even when we do hear accounts of orders being given on the battlefield to appeal to discipline, to order, formal declarations of war being made in a sort of chivalric, formalized sense. These are often ignored in the chaos, not just of combat, but properly of this, people's mentality must have been terrifying, like in terms of that. Again, I'm going to the fray, I don't give a damn. Like in theory, everybody's first among equal, among the nobility, and I have to emerge victorious above everyone so I can promote myself. I will get more retinue following me, all this stuff. They were really competing with one another. I mean, these are, yes, a millennium has passed from Tacitus' Germans, but don't think that these people was that different from those, again, warbanders that had all to be equal to the leader, because otherwise it would have been a shame for them. And this is valid for the same leaders sometimes. Like they didn't want to be challenged. For example, when Henry II attacked the Magyars without waiting for his army to be properly arranged in 1146, he suffered defeat. The veracity of Cosmas' account of a wedge-shaped battle formation used at Margraves is difficult to determine. As I explained also yesterday in that video about the Eurasian steppes tactics, there isn't really much of a wedge. I mean, yes, there are some descriptions that this was the case, but the point being that mostly aside from the fact that wedges were used to shift like the line of combat rapidly at different moments, so also to lead better men, as if there had been a sort of column following like a guy ahead. It's a hybrid between these two things. But the normal wedge formation would actually be just, one section of the line actually going ahead, but not being literally a triangle. So because think about the guy at the top, we would have been the best guy, annihilated immediately. And so not even in the context of shock charge situations, unless we're talking about smaller engagements in which truly, as we were saying before, the single guy can make the difference, would have been properly used. In fact, here we don't know what Cosmas' veridicity really is. The military capacities of the Babenbergs were initially limited due to their relatively small feudal lordship, as we've seen before. It was also geographically reduced, which likely affected the number of vassals they could command across Austria. This is confirmed by the Magyar invasion of 1042, by the way. Plus, the bishops of Passau were excluded from consideration alongside other major landowners from the outset, and the peasant population that the Margrave could muster was often unreliable, which can also be seen for the Battle of Marburg. So there is all a history of this margravial and ducal development. Initially, the Babenbergs were not in position simply of commanding the entire Austrian nobility. In their conflict with the Magyars, they relied on the support of imperial power as well, because at the end of the day, they were provincials that were assisted, depending on this matters of national concern, right, when in fact parts of the kingdom was threatened, and so that the royal expedition with contingents from various parts of the country would help the Austrians coping with that. This help arrived until the reign of Henry V. So we are between 1099 and 1125. Made a video about Henry V's reign, by the way, if you're interested. From there on, say, the Margraves were able to stabilize the situation, were less properly like the idea of a threat of the stabilizing, say, Hungarian activity. And so this is also normal, really. The military endeavors elsewhere also took place within the scope of imperial authority. The margrave Henry I, we've seen he died at the beginning of the 11th century, accompanied the King of Germany in his Polish campaigns. Right, so of course you see that the militaries were quite international. They went on campaigning into Italy, into the Western Frankish Kingdom, into, in fact, Poland and beyond, right? So they were meant to accompany the broader army of the realm with their contingents and being quite active, distinguishing themselves pretty much in the same way they would do at home. And the Bavarian troops were, in fact, sent along, right? They weren't just like Henry and his entourage. Ernest, 1055-1075, participated, this is another margrave of Austria, participated in the conflict with rebellious Saxons as part of the king's forces. This is during probably the rebellions in we are at the time in the investiture controversy, but before, like, the Saxons had always had trouble with the Franconians, and so there were rebels to put down within the same Germany. Prior to Henry Jasomirgott, we are between 1141 and 1156, no Babenberg Duke, or rather Margrave, at this point, ventured into Italy. Later, yes, that there is a possible exception in Leopold I, 976-994, and the reason is that we don't have enough documents, right? And then, of course, Austrian knights would have simply just been used by the German kings. Was the ministeriales? Those were really sent very very mandatory. Like, they didn't have a say; they were just serfs. So that was the point. You could do with them almost all what you wished. It was only under Leopold II, 1075-1095, whose substantial wealth is documented in historical records as well, and his more prominent son, that the material circumstances allowed to really set the basis for a significant transformation, also in the military development. Moreover, it was under Leopold II, 1050-1095, that the military subordination to the Bavarian Duke was abolished. This is outlined in the Privilegium Minus of 1156, but this had already happened. Essentially, the Dukes of Bavaria did not have a real grip on Austria already from the second half of the 11th century, outlining, in fact, a different provincial sphere of influence, and that was kind of obvious. And this because, again, as mushrooms, all these various seigniories and principalities are emerging, are becoming the new face of Germany, feudally. Never made a video about the Privilegium Minus. We talked again about both the Bavarian and the Austrian side of the story here, so you can check out those videos that I will list in the top fix comment down below. Indeed, this document is significant in a number of ways. It can be considered even as the culmination of the clash between these two powers, practical and technical reasons. Although there has been some greater interest for the later Babenberg period because of the greater abundance of sources, and again the general fame and prosperity of Austria at that point, there's still a lot to analyze about the relations between Austria and Bavaria, and probably the war between the two during the 11th century. Right? That I'm not aware whether this has actually been done in more recent years. It's difficult, admittedly. There aren't too many sources. We study military history at that point in a slightly say, more handicapped way, but again, things existed. Reality was there. History passed through that, and it must be really understood. And you understand that, say, this point, Bavarian versus Bavarian sort of also art of war would have been, again, very much Western without significant differences, but also helping to coalesce like the respective armies, right? There's a lot during the Swabian period, the Hohenstaufen, the 12th century, second half of the 12th century. There are lots of differences taking place, as we've seen also in Austria, especially from the third quarter of the century. That's really when Western Frankish feudalism is fully and scientifically imported and grafted on in Germany by the will of Frederick Barbarossa. That's probably the moment in which Germany opens, right, to a more, say, also updated dimension. Up to that point, it was a sort of rough, right, still sort of Romanesque, dark and forested country, and it's very difficult to just even picture it in that terms compared to, say, France or England. And so also Austria, at this point, takes that shape, more institutionally functional shape. And in terms of warfare, you have that establishment, for example, of military orders, the formalization of conflict according to chivalric norms, all very much costly, right, in the achievement. Is passed through further warfare, etc. But there is the emergence of a higher nobility of ducal power now, also recognized within properly the legal framework of the Kingdom of Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, by the Privilegium Minus, that had also like a lot of other, not just military, of course, and not even primarily military. That's the thing that mostly interests us, but also political, institutional consequences, matters on provisions on jurisdiction, court procedures. Of course, also military campaigns were regulated for the new duke. And all of this would actually give life to the to the modern country that we know of, that of course is the sum of Austria plus a couple of other lands that are not Austria. I'm very surprised, like I had a guy under the video on medieval Styria saying, oh, but Styria is not, like, also Styria is Austria. In medieval times. Congratulations. I hope that person is not from Austria, and definitely this person is not from Styria as well. I hope, like, it would be too, I don't know, metaphysically painful to accept. There are people who think like this, but let's say of course the most important land from which the Habsburgs would ultimately rule and coalesce there very gradually. Also their Central European power was this land that, as we've seen, had truly been remolded from like pretty recent times, late Carolingian, post-Carolingian times, and gradually compacted, and truly like being a medieval thing, right? There was no such thing like, also you had the Bavarians in the past, and this had been a people that was even there, like they were a migration era thing, at least probably in a territorial sense. They took the name after the Boianum, Bohemia technically, and Austria is truly a feudal. It's partly also there a migration phenomenon because the Ostsiedlung is sort of a continuation of that, but it's truly like a feudal creation, and that became a counter. Just to say how the Middle Ages really made so much of what we tend to also give for granted, and history is never to be given for granted, right? All right, I was glad to talk about this. This was a little special that I wanted to make from a while, because there is not so much, in fact, about Austrian precisely, especially from a military point of view, because as you understand, as I said since the beginning, like there's not really much truly distinctive about this area. Yes, there is history. There is, especially from the later medieval period, like focusing a bit on it, but there's not much of that centrality. We tend, of course, to be interested in Austria mostly because it made it to, in fact, the modern country in a way. Otherwise, we would say that the average interest would be lower, like compared to the other German states, many of which also sort of disappeared. I'm making some videos, as you know, about this other feudal states conglomerations. But this is, at least I think it's important, because the Middle Ages, and especially Germany, is that composite, is that sort of, if you don't get the local history, it's sort of a bit difficult to understand how it was molded. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.